Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. As we approach the year 2015, it might seem appropriate to make some predictions about the future. Yogi Berra famously said, "It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future." But our guest tonight is well positioned to do that. He is Richard Haass. Richard Haass is one of the great foreign policy thinkers. He is president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's going to take us through his educated guesses as to what's going to happen in 2015 and thereafter. Richard, we're delighted to have you with us.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Now, we might start with Russia, because that's very much in the news with the seesawing of the ruble. I mean, where is Russia in the world? You once called it a Burundi with missiles.
Russia's in a very difficult situation. It's a largely one-dimensional economy. That dimension is energy. Russia's budget is based on the idea of energy at roughly twice its current level. It's obviously an unsustainable situation for the long term, but Russia's got more than enough reserves to get through the short run. But that plus sanctions are putting tremendous pressure on the government. And the real question is whether this backdrop leads Mr. Putin to moderate his behavior to some extent in Ukraine and other parts of Europe, or as some predict, I don't, but some predict a so-called wag the dog scenario, where in order to distract attention from his economic difficulties, he looks to create some kind of a foreign policy dust-up. My hunch is he probably at least sounds slightly more reasonable on foreign policy, maybe even acts somewhat more restrained so as not to trigger new sanctions, and tries one way or another to simply weather this tough situation.
Well, what do you make of the precipitous decline in the price of oil? Do you think it's trumped up? Do you think it's done by the Saudis in order to put pressure on Iran and put pressure on Russia?
The Saudis are the least of the factors. The two biggest factors are, one, here at home, the United States. We have increased our energy production by 4 million barrels a day, from 5 to 9 million barrels over the last 4 or 5 years. So we've dramatically increased supply against a backdrop of extremely low world economic growth. Europe isn't growing, Japan isn't growing, China's growing much more slowly, and so forth. So you go around the world and you say, essentially, supply is up, demand is down. Guess what? Economics 101. So we're seeing a precipitous decline in the world price of oil, down below $60 or so a barrel. Now, the Saudis and others in OPEC have decided not to act. Even if they did act, I don't think they could transform the situation, but they could put some upward pressure on prices, but they've decided not to, both for economic reasons. They don't want to give up relationships with customers, and for geopolitical reasons, as you suggest. The Saudis in particular want to put tremendous pressure on Iran in the hopes that this gets a nuclear agreement that the Saudis would like.
So you don't see oil prices coming back anytime soon?
No, sir. I actually think this is the new normal. The only two things I could think of that would dramatically cause an up in the price would either be a crisis in Saudi Arabia, and that's possible, given what's going on in this part of the world with ISIS and the rest. At some point, one day we will wake up, and ISIS will put pressure on Saudi Arabia because it is at the heart of the Islamic world. And the other would be a crisis with Iran in the scenario where the talks were to fail and military force were used, and that would perhaps make it impossible, say, for tankers to go through the Straits of Hormuz. And that could get oil prices to dramatically increase. But otherwise, even if there are certain blips around the world in places like Nigeria or Venezuela or what have you, countries that produce, I don't think it's enough to dramatically affect the price of oil.
We'll get back to the Middle East, of course, but let's start with this horrific news out of Pakistan and what implications that might have. 126 kids murdered by the Taliban in a school. Is the United States can do anything except express concern and condolences?
The short answer is we can't do much. Pakistan is, at best, it's a weak state. A lot of things take place in Pakistan away from the center. in the so-called FATA, the federally administered tribal areas. And this is why it's technically within Pakistan. In many ways, it's not. It's areas beyond the real reach of state capacity. And that's the reality of Pakistan. So you've got a divided government. Civilians are weak. The military and the intelligence services are all too powerful and autonomous. You've got large parts of the country that are effectively out of government control with groups like the Taliban and more terrorist organizations than you and I could count. This is a country, by the way, of nearly, 190 million people now, say 50 million more than Russia. So the scale is enormous. It's got the world's fastest growing nuclear arsenal. So one of the potential nightmares for 2015 is that something goes wrong in Pakistan on a far greater scale than the tragedy we've just seen.
Does this mean that the United States is going to delay its drawdown of troops from Afghanistan because we don't want to see the Taliban coming back into Afghanistan? It seems that everything we fought for is in vain.
The short answer is I hope so. President Obama, as you say, has pledged to remove all U.S. military forces from Afghanistan by the end of his term, by the end of 2016. I believe it's an ill-advised idea. We should have learned from Iraq that the full pullout of American troops can actually lead to instability. In Afghanistan, you've got a new government that apparently wants the troops to stay. And I believe that the United States and some of the other coalition members should find a way to keep, not enormous numbers there, but say 10,000 or so troops, not doing combat missions, but doing advising and training. The Taliban are already there. The Taliban is already operating in large parts of the country, particularly the south. Every once in a while, they do something inside the reaches of the capital in Kabul. Pakistan continues to provide a sanctuary for the Taliban. So we've got to assume this civil war will continue. We've got to assume the civil war will get worse. So yes, I believe the United States is taking tremendous risks if it does not keep forces in Afghanistan.
In your November foreign policy piece entitled "The Unraveling," you
just to be clear, in foreign affairs, not
foreign affairs. I say foreign affairs. Forgive me. But it's still called "The Unraveling." I got that right.
Yes, sir.
And you did project a period of global disorder. In fact, you analogized the present period in the Mideast to the 30 Years' War. So you may have 30 years of global disorder.
Oh, I believe the Middle East is looking like Europe in the first half of the 17th century. What I believe we can look forward to, and I don't mean that in a positive sense, but in the sense of anticipation, is a prolonged period of instability within countries, between countries. This is a political religious feud. And there's nothing more combustible in history when forces of politics and forces of religious combine. We see it in Iraq, we see it in Syria. I'm afraid we're going to see it in other places in the region, potentially Jordan, potentially Lebanon, even Saudi Arabia. We're seeing elements of it in Jerusalem. As bad as the Israeli-Palestinian issue is, it doesn't take an enormous imagination to imagine it getting worse. So yes, I fear that this part of the world will be defined by not just turbulence, but by real instability and tremendous human suffering, not just for years, but potentially for decades to come.
Well, and you attribute this in some measure to a number of mistakes that the United States has made in the region. Now, perhaps
Sure.
you could take them off for us.
Just to be clear, I think it also reflects local realities. There's tremendous flaws in the region. This is a part of the world that's never come to terms with modernity. You've got both repressive states and weak states simultaneously. You've got large areas of territory outside state control. There's never been an agreement on what's religious and what's political, where the secular divide goes. But yes, the United States has made things worse, first by what it's done. And here I would put the Iraq War of 2003 at the top of the charts. It created tremendous instability in Iraq, and in many ways it paved the way for greater Iranian influence. It exacerbated dramatically tensions between Sunnis and Shia in the region. And then by things we haven't done. And here I would put at the top of the list Syria, not helping the opposition 3-4 years ago, when I believe there were opposition elements that we could help. And then when President Obama declared red lines, told Mr. Assad, if you were to cross these red lines by the use of chemical weapons, the United States would retaliate. And guess what? He crossed those red lines repeatedly, and the United States did nothing. And that sent a terrible message to the region, indeed to the world, that the United States was not reliable. And what has happened as a result is that in the region, many governments and other groups have increasingly taken matters into their own hand. And what we're seeing in the Middle East is a place where a lot of actors are behaving independently. They're not deferring to the United States. They're not depending on the United States. And we're seeing a region move step by step towards chaos.
Well, one of the errors we may have made was not identifying ISIS earlier. We didn't seem to understand that it was there until the genie was out of the bottle.
We were slow on ISIS, and I think we were also slow to realize the rot inside of Iraq. It wasn't just the strength of ISIS. What was stunning to so many people was how fast the Iraqi military collapsed. And what that reflected was the lack of commitment of Iraqi military forces for the central government. The United States, I believe, made a mistake for a long time in pushing Maliki, who was really a narrow sectarian Shia leader, to support his role in Iraq. And what we ended up with was the shell of a state. And we saw it collapse. So it was as much a question of Iraqi weakness as it was of ISIS strength.
And we also saw that Iran was able to advance its objectives in Iraq as a result.
Absolutely. It is ironic that we've gone from an Iraq that was the great buffer under Saddam Hussein, the balancer of Iranian power, and now Iraq has become an agent in some ways of Iranian influence and reach throughout the Middle East. The center of Iraq and the south are essentially under Iranian heavy influence, and the Sunnis and the Kurds feel in many ways politically dispossessed. And even though things have improved somewhat under Mr. Maliki's successor in Iraq, we shouldn't kid ourselves. Knitting Iraq back and to make it a functioning nation state is a long shot at best.
So history will record our going into Iraq as a disaster.
I wrote a book, as you know, earlier called War of Necessity, War of Choice. The 2003 Iraq War was a war of choice, and I think history will be rough and then some on both what the United States did and how it did it.
Well, indeed, you advised against it when you were in the State Department, and then,
I did.
Then you left.
And now I'm here on your show.
Now you're here predicting the future. I don't know. I think you're better off here than in the State Department. But ISIS, of course, shocked the world with the beheadings that were televised and were on the internet. Do you think if they hadn't engaged in this horrible behavior that we would have gone in to the degree we have?
Probably not. There was something about the beheadings that was so graphic. It was the kind of thing that you don't have to, if you will, be at the Council on Foreign Relations. You don't have to be a foreign policy expert to grab onto, to sense the fear. But the beheadings were designed. They were designed to intimidate. They were designed to define ISIS and basically send the message around the region, don't even think about resisting us, to create a sense of inevitability, and to some extent it's worked. ISIS has done quite well in Syria, and we're beginning to see that its message is moving, not just militarily or physically, but it's moving virtually. You know, your show's about the digital age, and ISIS is at once parked in the 7th century with their view of society, and in the 21st century with their use of social media.
They use the social media in order to rally their forces, mobilize their supporters, and then also to disrupt their adversaries.
Social media is as much of a weapon for them as the guns or the knives that they use. It could also create weakness in potential target states or societies. So yes, and one of the things we have to do then is realize ISIS needs to be resisted, not simply with arms, but needs to be resisted in similar ways. We need to demonstrate how miserable it is to fall under ISIS control, and also you can't beat something with nothing. Part of the challenge facing the leaders of the region.
It's an old political adage.
It has the virtue of still being true. That you've got to show people, particularly in the Sunni world, because a lot of this is a battle for the hearts and minds of the Sunni world, you've got to show there's an alternative to going back to this really brutal, intolerant, illiberal version of society. But you've got to demonstrate that there's something out there that's available and better.
Well, when the civil war in Syria arose, or shortly after it arose, and there was this tremendous loss of human life and the refugee problem, President Obama announced that Assad must go. Now it seems as though the political dynamic is changing and the alliance equation is changing, and he seems to be courting Assad, perhaps through Iran, perhaps through Russia, to unite against ISIS because of the common interest in defeating terrorism.
I think that
Isn't
goes
that all
too far.
very strange?
I think that goes too far. We're not courting Assad, as best as I can tell. I think it is true to say that he's the lesser of our priorities, that ISIS is a threat to the region, indeed potentially the world. Mr. Assad is not. He's a threat to his own population. Hundreds of thousands have died, millions have been made homeless. But as awful as he is and as bad as he's behaved, ISIS, I do think, is a larger threat. And what the United States needs to do, and it's awfully difficult, is to come up with and then implement the strategy that I believe puts the priority on doing something about ISIS, but ultimately also gets to Mr. Assad, because his continued existence in power does fuel the forces that groups like ISIS capitalize on. So there can't be a solution with him there in the long run. I think that's part of it. But you raise another point. If we're going to say people must go, whether it's Mr. Assad or
it's another red line.
And also we've got to either, one, make it happen, or two, if it does happen, like it did in Libya, we then haven't finished the job. Regime ouster is not the beginning and end of policy. It's reckless to say that people must go and either not kick them out, or if you do kick them out, not to put something better and enduring in their place. And that's what we have done time and time again in the Middle East. It's the ways we've made bad situations worse.
What about the Bogdanov mission? The deputy foreign minister of Russia meeting with Assad, having further meetings, I think, with Syrian officials in Moscow, and saying that he's going to bring Assad together with the United States and everybody will unite against ISIS. I mean, can we look to Russia as being an ally? Can we trust them when we have daggers drawn over the Ukraine?
I don't think we can allow Ukraine to totally dominate our relationship with Russia, but we can't have illusions. Russia has a different set of interests and goals in Syria than we do. They have a long-standing set of ties. It really is their principal beachhead, I guess I'd use that word, diplomatic in the region. And there can't be that kind of an accommodation with Assad. That would simply, again, be fuel to groups like ISIS and Nusra and other militant Sunni groups. So that kind of an approach is a non-starter.
So how do we get out of it? And can we get out of it in 2015?
No, we can't get out of it in 2015. What I think we can do in 2015 is continue to make progress in Iraq, where we have not just the use of air power, but we have several partners on the ground, the government, the Kurds, potentially Sunni tribes. I think in Syria it's a much tougher road. Air power, yes. We may have to consider at some point using force against Mr. Assad if he takes advantage of our use of air power. We've got to begin to develop partners on the ground. I think the Kurds are a potential one. I also have favored the idea of creating some kind of a pan-Arab expeditionary force from several of the Arab countries, potentially Turkey and the United States, where we would have special forces involved. We're not talking about anything on a large scale to reoccupy that country. God knows we don't want to do that. But you can't win this type of a struggle simply from the air. There's got to be some partner on the ground, and the United States has to call for it and potentially support it. But the bulk of the troops, I would say, have to come from Syria, from the Kurds, and from the Arab countries.
So do you foresee a stepped-up military intervention in the Middle East on the part of the United States?
Well, we've already gone from essentially 0 forces in Iraq up to now 3,000. And I think that's a sign of the times. And I think I would not be surprised if at some point you had small numbers of special forces in Syria. We talked before about the Americans finding a way to keep forces in Afghanistan, which I would think advised. So one of the ironies of, or whatever word you want to use, of Mr. Obama's presidency was that a big part of his presidency was essentially dialing down dramatically the American role in the greater Middle East. And what he did in some ways, I think, was dial it down too far, too fast. And now the United States is being forced to once again introduce forces in that part of the world.
Well, Obama has roughly 2 years left in his presidency. He's facing a Republican Congress, a Republican Senate. He has little hope of getting his agenda through in domestic issues, even though foreign policy begins at home. As you've said, is he going to become the foreign policy president, which is the only way he can get the congressional support for what he wants to do?
Quite possibly, which again is, shall we say, unexpected, and it falls under the ironic label. It's not a place I expect he ever saw himself. He'll continue to do things domestically. He obviously wants to preserve and possibly expand what he did in healthcare. He's obviously very interested in climate change. But yeah, I think he is going to be
interested in immigration, as I took that.
He's done some things unilaterally
himself,
there,
yeah.
but I think going much beyond that's going to be extraordinarily difficult for political reasons, as you suggest. So where does that lead him? I think it leaves you both because under our Constitution and our political tradition, presidents have more latitude when it comes to foreign policy. Plus the world is going to be an extraordinarily demanding place. He'll have all these opportunities, quote unquote, in the Middle East. I think probably his principal diplomatic focus in the Middle East will be getting an agreement with Iran by the end of June. That's a possibility. He still has the opportunity to make good on what was his biggest foreign policy idea of his first term, the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia. And that would involve not just diplomacy, but increased air and naval presence there, and the trade agreement, which then he would have to get through the Republican Congress. And if we had had this conversation a year ago, Jim, neither one of us would have mentioned ISIS or Ukraine. So one of the things that the president's also going to have to be prepared for is the unexpected. And it's quite possible that another subject we talk about, which is the low energy prices, could lead to crises around the world. I don't think it's at all out of the question that he could face tremendous instability, say, in Venezuela, which is a heavily oil-dependent country with virtually no dollar reserves, or in a country like Nigeria, which again is energy dependent, but also faces an internal terrorist problem with Boko Haram and all sorts of social divisions. So the president could have an extraordinarily full foreign policy inbox.
I would think. Now, you alluded to the negotiations with Iran. It's hoped that they'll come to some conclusion by June 30, a permanent solution. If they do, there's so many uncertainties. Will it be accepted by the Senate? Will it be accepted by the supreme ruler? And if all of them agree, is it going to be acceptable to Israel?
Well, what we know is a few things. One is it won't be permanent. There's going to be a fixed duration on any agreement, which in and of itself is problematic. I don't think the Senate will have to accept it. It's not going to be submitted as a treaty, as best I can tell, or necessarily even as a formal agreement. One question is, at what point does the Senate introduce or the Congress introduce new sanctions? And if so, are they tied to Iranian behavior, or if we have an agreement, to Iranian non-compliance?
Well, there has to be buy-in, because part of the deal will be to relax sanctions. You can't do that without Congress.
You have to get Congress on that part of it. You're exactly right. The real question to me, though, is the basic structure of the deal. What kind of capacities is Iran going to be permitted in the nuclear realm? We're not going to get them out of the business altogether. What kind of inspections will we be able to have? What kind of confidence will that give us about what they're doing and what they are not doing? And then, as you mentioned, the third leg of the stool will be sanctions relief. How much timed to what sort of arms control limits? Pulling this off and making it politically acceptable in Tehran and in Washington, I believe, will be extraordinarily difficult. So my prediction is, even if there is an agreement, and I think there's at least an even chance there'll be one, that won't end the problem. This is now going to become an open-ended part of the foreign policy landscape, where even if we get an agreement, there's then going to be ongoing conversations about whether Iran is complying with the agreement and what is it we should do in response.
And in this cauldron we call the Middle East, we can't forget Israel. Recently, the Palestinians called upon Israel, as you know, to vacate the West Bank by, 2016. They're taking it to the case to the UN. It seems to me that it becomes more unstable and more unstable as you go along.
Going to the UN won't accomplish any good, can't accomplish any good. We know that historically, the Israelis are not going to vacate the West Bank ever. They're going to forever, I believe, keep the areas where the 3 settlement blocks, the concentrations of settlement building have taken place. There's going to have to be all sorts of security arrangements elsewhere. But I don't think that set of issues is even on the table for the foreseeable future, given what's going on in the region, given Israeli politics, given Palestinian politics. You know, there's times in foreign policy you try to make things better. I actually would say here, this is one of those times you want to try to keep things from getting worse. So an ambitious agenda would be just that. We don't want Jerusalem to go from what has essentially been a fairly calm area to the next area, what you might want to call a political religious conflict.
Quickly, the pivot to Asia, nice word, but has it been anything other than rhetoric?
Very little. And Diplomatically, the administration has not invested in this part of the world as regularly as it did in its first term. And as we've discussed, we haven't seen the air and naval presence increase to the level it might. And there hasn't as yet been preparation on the home front for getting a trade deal through Congress. And I don't think that's a slam dunk, given where the Democratic Party is on economic issues, given the Republican Party's at times unwillingness to work with this president, and how the Republican Party has changed on trade. So getting a trade deal negotiated in the region and through Washington will be a major challenge. If
Major challenge. So as Yogi also said, if the world were perfect, it wouldn't be. So I ask you a question, are we headed for a prolonged period of world disorder, Richard Haass?
Absolutely, but what's always interesting about history is what's the balance between order and disorder. It's gotten worse over the last couple of years. The goal should be that it doesn't get worse yet. Gradually, hopefully, we can make it better. But that will be for 2015. I'd be happy with keeping things from getting worse.
Disorder light. Richard Haass, thank you for coming by.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. Please visit our website, www.digitalage.org. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best.